Join me to discuss this, a partner at WPA Opinion Research, Chris Wilson. Chris, thanks so much for making some time for us here on America's Forum.
Yeah, sure. As a pollster going on TV or this week, I kind of feel like Daniel walking into the lion's den a little bit. But it's a tough week for our profession, I think, from several levels. And you cited those numbers exactly right, and there's no question that they were off. I think the question is by how much and what happened.
Well, and again, I've been through elections with different pollsters. And I can recall one victory where the last poll I got, I was up by 10 points, and I ended up winning by 0.1%. In a generic sense, Chris, it said what? About 1 out of 30 polls for candidates can be just totally wrong. That, given your knowledge of statistics, there is a predictable anomaly. But
there is. That's exactly right. It's 1 in 20.
1 in 20.
And
okay.
I remember, actually, when I was first getting started in this business, reading a book by Ed Rollins, I think, and he wrote about that. And literally, it was my first year working for a polling firm, and he made a comment in that if you think a poll is wrong, you should redo it. And as I've grown up in this industry, and that was 25 years ago or so, I have always taken that approach. And I'll tell you, that absolutely happens. There are several instances where that 1 in 20 poll shows up, and you're looking at the numbers, and you just kind of have a feeling that something's wrong. And I think that is, just to draw a line in the sand here, that's kind of the difference between a good pollster and a polling factory. And there's a lot of those out there, and unfortunately, I think we have too many of them on our side, being the Republican side, that just kind of pump out numbers and don't spend a lot of time really analyzing what's right and what's wrong. And I'll say this happens. I'll give you a perfect example. When Bob Riley was first running for governor of Alabama, I got a survey back for him in which we were winning pro-choice voters and losing pro-life voters. And it obviously, you had to dig deep into the numbers to kind of find that one crosstab. But I looked at it, and then that caused me to look at a couple of other things and look at a couple of other geographic anomalies. There's just something wrong here. And we redid the survey. I'll give you one more example where that happened. We were doing tracking for now Senator Mike Lee. We were in the runoff election whenever he had challenged Bob Bennett for his seat in the Senate. And we were in the field tracking on the night of Game 7 of the NBA Finals. It's kind of right around this time of the year. It was the first time there'd been a Game 7 in like 20 years, maybe 18. Somebody may call and correct me on that. But we get the numbers back, and we look at it, and so all of a sudden we dropped several points, and our opponent had come up, and I'm like, what's going on here? And then we look at the sample, and we essentially, our sample of men between the ages of 35 and up were just bizarre. And the reason was none of them were going to talk to us on the phone. They were all watching the NBA Finals. It was Game 7. They didn't want to talk to a pollster. So, again, we didn't charge our client for that, and we redid it and added another night on. And thank goodness, still do Mike Lee's polling. And those are the anomalies that can happen to illustrate your point. But I think, the challenge here for someone in my industry is you've got to catch that 1 in 20.
Now, obviously, in this situation, John McLaughlin, who was Eric Cantor's pollster, and for purposes of full disclosure, in my last run for public office for the United States Senate, John McLaughlin was my pollster. Now, a whole lot of reasons are out there. They're not unique to John McLaughlin. Chris, you've touched on it. Not only sample size, but now with Americans changing, it used to be you call a residential phone number. But we have seen so many changes among Americans now relying on their cell phones as opposed to a traditional residential telephone. That's just one example. What else has to happen for conservative pollsters, for Republican pollsters to update their methodology for the 21st century?
Well, and that's an important question. I think I'm probably going to be the one Republican pollster this week that's going to defend John a little bit here, because I actually worked, when I mentioned my first job in polling, it was working for John. And I think John is one of the smartest people in the industry. Now, there is one caveat I'll add to that, in that I think, again, on the Republican side, I think we have too many polling factories. I would not put John in that category. He, as you know, since you worked with him, and I know this from having worked for him, it's been, again, almost 20 years ago that I worked for him, but John is very attentive to his races, and he, my bet is that he probably, if he went back and looked at this, would find that that there was something wrong, but that's kind of something that's you can't really talk about after the fact. And John is not one of those people who spends a lot of time with it, but one of the challenges in our industry, particularly, again, on the Republican side, if you look at the Republican polling community, it tends to come more from the apprenticeship side of things. What I mean by that, JD, is they're pollsters who learned from another pollster and then became a pollster. Rather than, if you look at the Democrat side, they tend to be more from the academic community. And I think that's an important distinction because statistics is a science, and it is a ongoing developing science. And it is, I will tell you, we are one of the biggest spenders on, in fact, from the Republican side, I don't know of anybody else who does what we do in terms of investing in research and development and the implementation of new developments in the world and the science of statistics into our work. And that is, you bring up the cell phone penetration side of things, and that was kind of the big hit on Republican pollsters after the 2012 cycle. Well, I remember actually being yelled at by the executive director of the NRCC. I'm sure you dealt with those people too. This was back in the late 2000s. So I won't mention names, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
I might have a clue or two. Go ahead.
Yeah, for two things. For one, our use of cell phones, because everybody else was telling them they didn't have to, and it made us more expensive. And this was 2008, just to put a year on it. It may have been 7, 9, somewhere in that range. It was that cycle. And second was the fact that we were using voter files instead of random digit dialing. Now, at that point, you could not get cell phones as a part of voter files, so we sent them out and had them matched for cell phone numbers. It was Firm Atlanta that we found that did it. And yeah, it made us more expensive, but it was the right thing to do. And it is and now I took a certain degree of solace after the 2012 cycle that after a lot of polling is wrong, that that the committees came together and said, oh, well, maybe we should call from voter files, and maybe we should use cell phones as part of our sample. That's been a part of what we've done for a long time. But I'll tell you, I'm a very active member of the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers. We have someone at their annual conference every year. We have presented those conferences, 2 of the last 4 conferences on things that we have done in the world of statistics. And I would say I have only once seen another Republican pollster at those conferences. Every time there's someone from the major Democratic pollsters at those conferences and presenting at those conferences. And they're fascinating presentations. I'll get, not to go too far into the weeds, but the most recent one, GQR, who was Hillary Clinton's pollster, did a big presentation on they called back people who said they were not voting in the election. So whenever you screen somebody out, they called those people back after the election and found out that half of them actually did vote. So it shows that even the screen-out process is wrong, and that goes into we're now making allowances for that and what we do. So all those things are developments that I think are important for the polling community to stay on top of.
And you touched on that right there, Chris, the whole notion of calling people back because, and again, not to pick on John McLaughlin, for it's worth noting that sadly in my case, his polls were dead on what was going to happen to me in the 2010 Senate primary in Arizona. But this notion of calling people back and trying to determine turnout, and in the case of this Cantor Brat race, turnout was much higher than what had been previously expected. The intensity was there.
It was, and but it can be allowances made for that, JD. They don't necessarily have to be done through callbacks. I'll give you another example of this. We have developed, and we've written about, we actually presented on this at the last April conference, a methodology called adaptive sampling. We won a Poly for this from the American Association of Political Consultants. And it's what allowed us to miss most of the problems that other firms had in 2012 with the challenges that they had with turnout. And I'll give you a perfect example of a race with this. We did Ted Cruz's polling last cycle. And in the runoff, we were running against David Dewhurst. The Friday before the runoff, we put out numbers. It may have been the Wednesday, it was somewhere in that time period. It was the week before, showing Cruz up 15 points. Dewhurst pollster put out numbers having him up 5 points. That's a 20-point difference between the two. The problem was Dewhurst pollster was interviewing a turnout universe of 900,000 because that is what it had always been. Our universe had expanded utilizing adaptive sampling.
And you were able to make a difference there. The problem, as I think you can appreciate, Chris, is that 4-letter word of time. But thank you for your insights, showing us both the art and the science of polling. And good luck in your efforts, Chris, to maintain your posture as a pollster with results not making you smell like a poll cat. Listen, we really appreciate the time. Look forward to having you back, Chris, here on America's Forum. So you heard it straight from Chris Wilson, a pollster, saying that conservative pollsters have to adapt to new techniques. We'll cover more issues concerning politics in today's news coming up. Stay with us.